In December 1968, as the country reeled from a year of loss and unrest, a young woman vanished from a motel room just outside Atlanta, Georgia. Under circumstances so strange, investigators could barely make sense of them. With almost no leads and a shaken mother's account of two masked intruders, the search for 20-year-old Barbara Mackle became a race against time that gripped her family and drew national attention. What investigators would uncover over the next 4 days was unlike anything they had encountered before. Welcome to Southern Mysteries, exploring Southern history and true crime. I'm your host, Shannon Ballard. This is episode 180, The Kidnapping of Barbara Jane Mackle. In December 1968, the United States was closing out a year that had already felt impossibly heavy. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April, Senator Robert F. Kennedy in June. Protests over Vietnam and civil rights filled streets and evening newscasts. It was a year of grief, uncertainty, and anger. In the middle of it all, far from the headlines of Washington and Memphis, a quiet young woman in Atlanta was trying to get through her college finals and make it home to her family in Florida in time for Christmas. Her name was Barbara Jane Mackle. Barbara was born in 1948 to Robert and Jane Mackle, who lived in Coral Gables, Florida. Her father was a successful Florida land developer and co-founder of the Deltona Corporation, a major home building company. She had an older brother, 4 years ahead of her. Barbara's life was one of privilege, a comfortable home, a prominent father, and good schools. But people who knew Barbara never spoke of her privilege first. They described her as soft-spoken, serious about school, and incredibly loyal to her friends. Not a socialite, and not someone who sought the spotlight. In the fall of 1968, she was studying at Emory University in Atlanta, and like thousands of students that year, she got sick. That fall and winter, a flu pandemic swept through the United States. College campuses were hit hard, and Emory was no exception. Barbara came down with the flu just as she was supposed to finish her exams and head home for Christmas break. Her mother, Jane, was worried. Her daughter was 20 years old, but this flu was known to be dangerous, and she was worried about Barbara. Rather than leave her daughter to ride out a high fever in a dorm room surrounded by other sick students, she made the decision to travel to Atlanta and drive Barbara home herself. Jane checked into the Roadway Inn in Decatur, just outside Atlanta, so she and Barbara would have a place to rest before the long drive home. On the night of December 16th, Barbara's boyfriend, Stuart Woodward, stopped by to visit and check on her. He would leave later that night, not realizing how important his brief visit would become. In the early morning hours of December 17th, Barbara and her mother were still awake as the symptoms of the flu made it difficult for Barbara to sleep. They tried to talk to pass the time, and eventually, around 4 a.m., drifted toward rest. But soon after, the sound of a knock on the door of room 133 cut through the quiet. From the hallway, a man's voice called out. He identified himself as a police officer and said there had been a car accident involving a man driving a white Ford. This was the kind of car Barbara's boyfriend Stuart drove. A worried Barbara jumped out of bed, ran to open the door, and immediately regretted that decision. There was no calm, reassuring patrolman at the door. Barbara saw a masked figure holding a shotgun, and beside him, a smaller person in a ski mask. Later, her mother Jane would tell investigators that the smaller figure was so slight, she thought it might be a very young boy, possibly around 12 years old. Both of them forced their way into the room. The taller intruder carried the shotgun and shouted orders to an already feverish and disoriented Barbara, who tried to understand what was happening as she and her mother were told to sit on one of the beds. The taller figure knocked Barbara down. As her mother tried to intervene, she was overpowered. As the smaller figure told her her daughter was being kidnapped, Jane was bound and chloroformed. Barbara was forced at gunpoint out of the room and into a waiting car in the parking lot. When Jane came to, her daughter was gone, and the room smelled of chemicals. Her hands and feet were bound, and her head was pounding. When she finally realized what had happened, she managed to struggle free and run for help. Motel staff called the police, and patrol cars arrived at the Roadway Inn in the pre-dawn hours. Suddenly, the quiet motel was at the center of what would become one of the most terrifying kidnapping cases in American history. Officers entered the room and saw what Jane had woken to: scattered bedding, the rope and tape marks that showed where she had been restrained, and clear signs of a struggle. They listened as a shaken Jane tried to give them something to work with. She told them about the knock at the door and the man who claimed to be a patrolman. She recounted all she could remember about the figures who forced their way into the room, including the fact that one of them was very small. So small, Jane was convinced a 12-year-old boy had helped a man kidnap her daughter. By sunrise, 20-year-old Barbara Mackle's disappearance made news in Atlanta. The rest of her family was still in Florida. They were frantic and helpless. Her mother sat in a police station, trying to piece together any detail to help with the search for her daughter. And somewhere on the outskirts of Atlanta, Barbara was being carried away into a carefully constructed nightmare. Inside the Decatur police station, Jane Mackle had recounted all she remembered of the events that unfolded in the early morning hours. But it wasn't much. The FBI immediately opened an official kidnapping case. Agents began assembling what little they had from Jane and the belief, based on Jane's account, that they were looking for two males, one older and one younger. They had no vehicle description, no license plate, no clear direction of travel, and no secondary crime scene. Only the belief that ransom or revenge had to be the motive for this kidnapping, which meant all the Mackles could do was wait. As word reached the Mackle home in Coral Gables, Barbara's father, Robert, prepared for news no parent ever expects. He quickly arranged a flight to Atlanta and joined investigators in a race for answers. The first break in the case came when the kidnappers made contact. A ransom message was delivered to the Mackles. It was direct and chilling. The kidnappers demanded $500,000 in cash in exchange for Barbara. The note insisted she was alive and unharmed, but offered no proof. It warned that she would not remain safe if law enforcement did not follow instructions precisely. Investigators studied every line of that message: the handwriting, the phrasing, the level of planning, the reference to specific denominations of bills. They debated whether the reassurance that Barbara was comfortable was real or a tactic to keep her parents compliant. But what mattered most was the kidnappers had made contact. A time was set for the ransom drop. The instructions told Robert where to go, how to pack the money, and how to leave it. And he followed every detail, driving alone as agents trailed at a distance. They chose positions carefully, trying to remain unseen, but close enough to react once the exchange was made. For a moment, it seemed the handoff might actually take place. Then, at the worst possible time, an unrelated patrol car rolled through the area. The officer driving that patrol car had no idea a ransom operation was unfolding nearby. But his presence was enough to ruin everything. The kidnappers never appeared. Hours passed with no word, no phone calls, no instructions or sign of whether Barbara was still alive, or how long she could survive, whatever circumstances she had been taken into. And the kidnappers had proven they were watching closely enough to spot even the smallest unexpected movement. The FBI intensified their investigation. Agents re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined timelines. The longer the silence lasted, the grimmer the possibilities became. After the failed ransom drop, every hour without contact deepened investigators' fears that the kidnappers had cut off communication entirely, or worse, that they had already harmed Barbara. But 24 hours later, a message arrived. The note from the kidnappers confirmed they had noticed police presence at the first drop, and they blamed Robert Mackle for it. This time, along with their note, they included proof of life, a Polaroid photograph showing Barbara propped up, her face pale and exhausted from illness. She held a piece of cardboard with one word written in block letters: kidnapped. The photograph was close-cropped. Behind her was a padded surface and a neutral background. Investigators studied the photo repeatedly, magnifying shadows and searching for clues. They couldn't determine whether she was indoors or outdoors, lying on bedding or something else entirely. The background gave them nothing to work with. But this was a positive sign. Barbara was alive long enough for this photograph to be taken. And maybe she was still alive. The kidnappers included a note for Robert with a second set of instructions. The note detailed a new location for the ransom drop and instructed Robert that if the FBI interfered again, they wouldn't make a third attempt. Just before dawn, Robert Mackle made his way to a remote, wooded area. This time, everything was quiet and went as planned. Robert Mackle left a suitcase filled with ransom money exactly where he had been instructed to put it. A short time later, a figure emerged from the dark, retrieved the suitcase, and disappeared into the woods. That exchange took seconds. Even agents watching from a distance couldn't determine who the person was, or whether someone else waited deeper in the woods. Within hours, the kidnappers sent directions to investigators. They instructed them to go to a wooded area just outside Atlanta. The note described landmarks that were vague, but investigators were determined. They pressed on. They scanned the ground for anything disturbed: footprints, broken branches, mounded soil. For a while, it looked like the directions led nowhere. Then one of the agents noticed something small and out of place: a length of white plastic pipe poking up through dirt and leaves. It was no more than a few inches tall, and at first glance, it could have just been trash. But the agent knelt beside it, brushed away leaves, and placed his ear against the top. He heard something faint, then called out Barbara's name. From beneath the ground, there was a response. The agents acted fast. They began digging with their hands, scooping away soil as fast as they could. Inches below the surface, they uncovered a flat fiberglass lid. They pried it open, and inside was Barbara Jane Mackle, alive. She was weak from the flu and from days of confinement. She was covered in dirt, but she was conscious. When agents moved to lift her out of the box, she managed to whisper, "Thank you." She was wrapped in blankets, carried out of the woods, and taken to a local hospital. News of Barbara Mackle's rescue spread immediately. But hospital staff worked with law enforcement to keep her shielded from cameras and reporters as she was admitted and treated. Doctors confirmed she was dehydrated, ill, and exhausted, but she was stable. Her parents rushed to her bedside, overwhelmed by the joy of seeing their daughter alive. In the hours after her rescue, investigators gave Barbara time to warm up, rest, and receive medical care. She was weak and still feverish, but she was alert. When agents finally sat with her, they began carefully asking questions about her kidnapping and anything she could remember about the people who took her. And very quickly, they learned that almost everything they believed about the kidnappers was wrong. Barbara explained that the smaller intruder had spoken very little and moved differently than the taller one. Both of her kidnappers wore masks, but Barbara was able to estimate their height and weight, along with a description of their build and the pitch of their voice. She believed the second masked figure, the one her mother thought might have been a young boy, was actually a woman. This meant investigators had to reconsider everything, including who to look for, how they might be traveling, and whether one or both were still in the area. Barbara also described the person who had driven her away from the motel, a man with a calm but commanding voice. She recalled being given a drink that made her groggy. She remembered being carried and placed somewhere dark. Then, as she put it, there was nothing but voices, distant above her, before she passed out again. She remembered one important detail. She had briefly seen one of the kidnappers without their mask, just before everything went black. It wasn't long enough to form this perfect memory, but she provided what she could. In those split seconds, she saw a young man, clean-shaven, with light hair, a thin face, and as she put it, a calm, almost methodical manner. As FBI agents continued to talk to Barbara at the hospital, field agents were able to examine the location where she had been found. It was a fiberglass box the size of a coffin, customized and outfitted down to the smallest detail. The capsule was lined with foam padding. Inside were supplies meant to keep Barbara alive: small bottles of water, packets of food, blankets, a pan for waste, a battery-powered light, and a small fan for ventilation. 2 plastic air hoses ran from the top of the box to the surface, hidden by brush. The interior was tight. Barbara could sit up slightly, but she couldn't fully straighten her legs. A small buzzer inside the capsule allowed Barbara to signal for help, but her attempts earlier in the ordeal went unanswered. She was in a remote, wooded area. No one was around to see that buzzer go off. Investigators had never seen something like this before. This kidnapping had been carefully planned, with a hiding place that was constructed, reinforced, and had likely been built and buried well in advance of Barbara's abduction. That level of preparation told the FBI they were dealing with people with technical ability, a lot of patience, and confidence to attempt a complex crime. The kidnappers had made their getaway with the ransom money, but the FBI worked quickly. They began reconstructing the events surrounding the second ransom drop. Agents retraced Robert Mackle's route, searching for tire tracks, footprints, or discarded materials. They found signs that the person who retrieved the suitcase escaped by boat. This meant the kidnappers were likely traveling south. Agents worked with Barbara and compiled a composite description of the man she had briefly seen. This information, combined with evidence from the ransom drop and the direction of escape, gave the investigation much-needed momentum. It wasn't long before they identified a prime suspect, Gary Stephen Christ, a young man with a history of criminal activity, including a previous prison escape. Chris was intelligent, resourceful, and known to drift through South and Central America under aliases. Records placed him in the Atlanta area around the time of the kidnapping. Investigators believe Chris had chosen Barbara because he had heard about her family and believed they could pay a large ransom. If Chris was involved, investigators knew he had not acted alone. One name quickly rose to the top of their suspect list: Ruth Eisemann-Schier, a University of Miami student from Honduras. She was bright, multilingual, and had disappeared from campus shortly before the kidnapping. With the identification of suspects, the FBI issued fugitive alerts, and agents spread across Georgia and Florida. Airports, bus stations, and ports were put on watch, and roadblocks went up along highways leading south. Agents learned that on December 20th, just hours after the ransom exchange, Chris abandoned a boat he'd used to escape and fled into the marshlands near Pompano Beach, Florida. Agents tracked him to a small island where he was captured after several days on the run. At the time of his arrest, Chris was sunburned, dirty, and exhausted. And authorities recovered portions of the ransom money he had on the island with him. With Chris in custody, attention turned to Ruth Eisemann-Schier. Over the next several weeks, investigators traced her movements across the Southeast. She moved through Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, working odd jobs, traveling under false names, and avoiding contact with anyone who might recognize her. Because she had participated in a high-profile kidnapping, she made history when the FBI added her to the 10 most wanted fugitives list in early 1969. She was the first woman ever placed on the list. Her run from the law ended on February 7th, 1969, when she was arrested in Norman, Oklahoma. She'd applied for a nursing job, which required a fingerprint check. This led to her capture and arrest. Gary Stephen Christ was charged in federal court for kidnapping, facing overwhelming evidence, including Barbara's testimony, the buried capsule, and the ransom money recovered at the time of his arrest. Christ agreed to plead guilty. He received a life sentence in federal prison. The judge described the crime as exceptionally cruel and meticulously planned. News accounts at the time echoed that assessment, writing that the idea of burying a young woman alive had horrified the nation. Ruth Eisemann-Schier was also charged with kidnapping. She pleaded guilty in 1969 and received a 7-year prison sentence. After serving 4 years, she was paroled and deported. Chris' life sentence did not keep him behind bars permanently. After serving a little more than a decade, he was paroled in 1979. His release was controversial, especially for those who believed the brutality of the crime warranted spending the rest of his life behind bars. He attempted to build a new life, even managed to obtain a probationary medical license in Indiana, and Chris briefly practiced as a physician. That decision by the state licensing board drew criticism. His license was later revoked for failing to disclose disciplinary issues from his medical residency. Whatever plans he had for a new path collapsed. In 2006, Chris was arrested again, this time for his involvement in a cocaine trafficking operation after federal agents found large quantities of drugs on a boat registered in his name. He served 3 years in prison and was released in 2010. As to Barbara Mackle, her family supported her as she focused on recovering from the trauma of her abduction. In an effort to process her experience and correct misinformation. She co-wrote a book with her father. 83 Hours Till Dawn was written to ensure the public record reflected what really happened. After the book was published, Barbara returned to school. She married her longtime boyfriend, Stuart, and they built a life together with as much privacy as possible. Barbara raised a family and lived away from the media spotlight that followed her story so closely in the late 1960s. Friends described her as steady, warm, intelligent, and deeply grounded. Someone who preferred her life to be defined not by what had been done to her, but by the people she loved. Barbara's kidnapping captivated the country in 1968, a year that had been defined by violence and upheaval. The details of the crime were unlike anything Americans had heard of before in kidnapping cases: the methodical planning, the buried capsule, and ultimately the rescue that many doubted would happen. When Barbara was found alive, the relief was felt far beyond Atlanta or her hometown of Coral Gables. It was a moment of relief at the end of a dark year, proof that even in the worst circumstances, survival is possible. For all the sensational storytelling that surrounded this case over the decades, the heart of it remains simple. The Mackle family lived through days of fear most of us can only imagine. But even in the darkest moments, they refused to believe the story would end in tragedy. They held on to hope. And when Barbara returned home, she chose to live the rest of her life on her own terms. Maybe it's fitting that her rescue came in December, at the end of this difficult year, a reminder of what Maya Angelou once wrote: "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." Southern Mysteries is created and hosted by me, Shannon Ballard. You'll find sources for this episode in the show notes, in your podcast player, or at southernmysteries.com. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're following Southern Mysteries where you're listening so you never miss a new one. And if you have a moment, rate or review Southern Mysteries on your podcast app. Your feedback really helps more history and true crime fans discover the show. And if you'd like to support Southern Mysteries, which is an independent podcast, you can hear even more stories when you become a patron. My Patreon members get access to exclusive content, including the full archive of the first 3 seasons, ad-free episodes, and you can even give it a level where you get access to my patron-only podcast, Audacious. If you want to learn more, join, and start listening today, you can check it out at patreon.com/Southern Mysteries. Or if you already have the Patreon app, just open it up and search for Southern Mysteries Podcast. I appreciate everyone who's taken the time to be a patron in the past or currently supporting the show. It's part of how I'm able to continue to tell stories like the one you heard today. Thanks for that. And as always, thank you so much for listening to Southern Mysteries.